Welcome to Foreign Policy for America and the Quincy Institute's panel discussion on the essential role of dissent in government. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move US foreign policy away from endless war and towards rigorous diplomacy. While the Trump administration has taken disdain for contrary opinion to a new level, reality is that the culture of the federal government has long dismissed voices of dissent. In her new book, The Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age, QI non-resident fellow Lizzie Shackelford shares her personal experience as a diplomat trying to push back against the status quo and offers insight into the State Department's long history of ignoring others who have tried to do the same. The book raises important questions based on Lizzie's experience in South Sudan about the role of the United States government in supporting and bankrolling South Sudan's independence and the domestic forces in the United States that pushed for this policy option. It also raises questions about when, if ever, the United States exercises diplomatic leverage effectively over a friend. These questions are particularly relevant in regard to the role of US military foreign military assistance. The United States provides about $17 billion a year in assistance to foreign militaries. And the story Lizzie tells raises profound questions about when, if ever, the US government uses this leverage effectively to actually reduce war and reduce human rights violations. We have an excellent panel today that will help us address all of these issues. And our moderator is none other than Andrew Albertson, the Executive Director of Foreign Policy for America. If you are joining us via Zoom, as always, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask your questions. If you are watching this via YouTube, please ask your questions through the comment section on the YouTube page. So without any further ado, please welcome Andrew Albertson, who will introduce the panel and lead the conversation. Andrew?
Well, thanks so much, Trita. That's a great start for us all. And I'm just really pleased to be able to do this together with Quincy Institute. And let me just, you've done such a great job starting us off, but I do just want to say thank you to the Quincy Institute for partnering on this, for you, to Jessica Rosenblum and Cody Akavi for getting us set up so well and making this such a smooth process. And also Jessica Andrews, our comms director. So really pleased to be able to do this. I am so excited to be able to have this conversation. I think anytime we can have a look inside the workings of American diplomacy and see the lives of the individuals doing that work, I think that's powerful. Also, this is just a fantastic book that Lizzie, you've written, and I really commend everybody to it. This is gonna be a theme of the day, but this is the book, The Dissent Channel. We are all on the internet right now. You can go over to Amazon and pick it up right now if you chose. And I'm sure someone will very helpfully put a link on the chat feature. Let me just quickly introduce our two speakers today. Elizabeth Shackelford was a career diplomat in the US State Department until 2017, December 2017, when she resigned in protest of the Trump administration. She had served in the US embassies in Poland, in South Sudan, in Somalia, and also in Washington, DC. For her work in South Sudan during the outbreak of civil war, Elizabeth received the Barbara Watson Award for Consular Excellence, the State Department's highest honor for consular work. That experience also gave rise to this book, which we're going to be discussing today. And Elizabeth is a non-resident fellow with the Quincy Institute. Ambassador Nancy McEldowney, I'm also just so pleased to be able to join with you today. Ambassador McEldowney is the director of the Master of Science in Foreign Service program at Georgetown University, which, full disclosure, I graduated from myself. I don't want to brag too much on the institution, but I do just want to say it's a special place, an institution at a Jesuit university, Georgetown, dedicated to inculcate a spirit of service and to educate future diplomats. Ambassador McEldowney previously served as director of the Foreign Service Institute, where she oversaw the formal training of American diplomats. Her distinguished career includes serving as director of European Affairs on the National Security Council, as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of State's Bureau of Europe and Eurasian Affairs, as Deputy Chief of Mission in Turkey and also in Azerbaijan, and as Ambassador to Bulgaria. And she's one of our advisory board members at Foreign Policy for America. So just really wonderful to be together with the two of you. Lizzie, Your book is what prompts us to get together today. So I want to start with you. We're going to talk about a lot of things, as Trita highlighted actually in his intro. But before we get into that, I wondered if you could just sort of set the stage for us. Talk to us a little bit. This is your second tour that you're writing about, and your second tour as a Foreign Service officer in Juba in South Sudan. So tell us a little bit about what that was like to arrive, what was happening in Juba in 2013 when you arrived, just to get us started.
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's really great to be here. And yeah, of course, thrilled to be able to collaborate on this with you and Nancy and Trita and everyone else. So yeah, starting out, so I was a second tour officer. So for those who are not that familiar with the Foreign Service, you are still smack in the middle of being a junior officer at that stage. You still haven't really learned the ropes. My first tour was, quite relatively speaking, an easy and smooth one. I was sent to Warsaw, Poland, which was, kind of a standard embassy, a really great experience for learning, but not the challenge that I faced in South Sudan. But I had spent some time before the Foreign Service working in international development, and I really wanted to get back to Africa. I really wanted to go somewhere that was a challenge. And at the time that I entered the Foreign Service, which was in 2010, South Sudan was on its way to becoming an independent country. And I'd been tracking that and was quite interested. So when it came time to bid my first time around, I looked and I saw, okay, South Sudan's not up. You get to kind of put your preferences in order when you're first in the Foreign Service, and then they send you wherever they want to. But anyway, the second time around, I'm in Poland and I'm looking at the options, and South Sudan is on the list. I thought it'd be really competitive. I thought everybody would want to go to Juba. As it turns out, nobody else wanted to go to Juba. But I was inspired by the idea that this was a new country. It seemed to me like it would be a clean slate. For those who think that sounds naive, it was. Read the book. I figured that out. And it was the idea that the United States was investing a lot of time and effort and kind of political currency to try and make this country work. So the idea that the US government cared this much about an African country that was really at such a starting point was inspiring. Fast forward to my arrival, and I realized it was a little bit more complicated than that.
And if I could ask, so you went and you were splitting your time as a consular officer and a human rights officer. Okay, so what does that mean in practice? And I think we have a little bit of a sense of what a consular officer does, maybe not full sense, but especially what a human rights officer is.
So those are two completely separate jobs. The only reason you would ever see this happen, and I'd be curious on Nancy's thoughts on this, would be because you're wildly understaffed at the embassy. We didn't have much of a consular section because the country was only 2 years old. So everything had happened out of Khartoum in the north. So it basically meant that one side of my job was tracking and reporting on human rights occurrences and incidents and problems in the country. And that was kind of your pure political officer role as a diplomat. It's, you go, you have meetings, you do reports, you listen, you investigate is kind of a strong word, but you're following up to try and get to the bottom of things. And then you're reporting this back to Washington, presumably to influence what our policies are. The other side of that coin was that I was the consular officer, the only one at the mission. So usually that meant handling a few small appointments for Americans who'd lost their passport. But if an American citizen died or got sick or got arrested, and all three of those things seem to happen fairly often, that became kind of really the only focus, because unlike a lot of countries, you don't have many resources in the country to help you get through that. And we do a lot to help our American citizens overseas.
And Nancy, I'm curious, when you were in, we talked about your last 3 tours in Turkey and Azerbaijan and Bulgaria. I'm curious, sort of, first of all, did you have human rights officers in those spots? Yeah.
It's normal to have human rights officers who are doing the kind of investigating work that Lizzie mentioned in most embassies. It's very unusual to have someone doing what is more than 2 full-time jobs. Lizzie's an impressive person, but she must have been staggering under that tremendous load. And to go into such a volatile environment and to be so understaffed and have to deal with such dramatic and disruptive change. I'm sure it was a very intense experience, which is why it's such a fantastic and evocative story.
Well, let me ask you that too. When we think about diplomats serving overseas, diplomacy, I don't think it naturally comes to mind for folks, Juba or a conflict zone. So how common is it for folks to have tours in conflict affected countries like this?
It's actually quite frequent because, when you think about how many places around the world have conflicts underway, we send diplomats. We have everywhere. We have a principle of universal representation. So everywhere the U.S. can have an embassy or some sort of representation, we do. But then also what happens is you go to a place that you think is fairly stable, and then circumstances change and you're right in the middle of violence. And that happens to almost every American diplomat over the course of their career. Sometimes it's very interesting, sometimes it's pretty devastating, and people end up really getting hurt.
You were there in a particularly volatile time in the midst of the Civil War. In the midst of that and trying to evacuate American citizens must have been, I can't imagine the pressure or what you must have been under in dealing with that. Can you share with us a little bit about the circumstances then and what exactly the embassy staff needed to do for the American citizens?
Sure. And I think I'll start by explaining that, most people haven't had the opportunity to be in a country like as it unravels into civil war. And, I think it's important for people to understand, and I talk about this in the book, that it was a week before the Civil War broke out that USAID was co-sponsoring an investment conference in Juba. The things that we were doing to try and kind of pretend that this country was getting on its right feet was really quite impressive. But it unraveled very quickly. And so you never know which countries you go to when you're going to need to be ready to really react quickly as a group. And you don't have a playbook for exactly every incident that goes on, but you do have, we train and war game and plan out how you react to different issues. And that's basically how it played out. The night that violence started in Juba, everyone got together and we started looking through, which tripwires have crossed and what does that mean? Everybody has an emergency action plan for every embassy that's set up, and you go through that. So our embassies and consulates might not always be properly staffed and resourced, but we were, I think, about as prepared as you could be to respond, kind of with planning and what you do. You get in touch with Washington, you figure out what additional resources you need, you warn American citizens about what's going on, which is a very, very high priority for us. And then you look at the resources you have and you figure out how to allocate them. It was an incredible experience for me professionally to watch that in action.
I want to encourage folks who are listening in to go ahead and add any questions to the Q&A function that you can see in the bottom of your screen. I know normally we sort of wait to the end of events to ask questions. We're going to try to take those as they come throughout the event. So feel free to add those as you like. Let me just get to the first one and maybe I'll pose this to both of you. This comes from Jenny and Sherry Thompson. So Ms. Shackelford's book blurb describes foreign policy driven more by inertia than principles to suit short-term political needs over long-term strategies. So the question is, how do you change this short-term myopia in political and economic systems that reward short-term results and consistently fail to punish long-term harmful consequences?
Well, I think that's a really good way to put it. I'll start with something short and then I'd love to hear Nancy has to say on this because she has far more experience. But I think the term you use in that rewards short-term thinking is exactly what's at play here. It's about how we're rewarding and promoting people, both like promoting in a very personnel sense, and how we're what the successes are in the longer terms in terms of how people feel about the success of our foreign policy. So on a very granular level, I use this example a lot, but you're rewarding people and promoting people based on how the numbers and budgets that they're managing. This happens more even in areas of like international development and the military, but it happens in diplomatic contexts as well. So what that does is it means that it always behooves you to expand your activities and your partnerships with a country. It really, you don't get rewarded for saying, you know what, this is kind of a waste of our investment in our currency. I think as my legacy here in country X, I'm going to shut down a lot of activities that aren't working. That doesn't really benefit you professionally. So at the very personal level, we have some disincentives there. On the bigger level, I think it's harder to address. On a personal level, you can come up with new metrics to use to measure someone and whether or not they should move up in the ranks. On the political level, though, you're working with a 4-year administration system, and people have to show, they have to show progress and successes. And I think we saw that in South Sudan. There was this idea that nobody wanted it to look like it was shredding to pieces on their watch. So there wasn't a real incentive to accept that. My very probably non-rewarding answer here is basically, I think that we need to find a way to be more honest with our foreign policy. And we need to find a way for that to not be so damaging politically for people, because that is where you get the disincentive.
I mean, I think your book does such a great job at sharing detailed examples of what you were doing as an on-the-ground foreign service officer, thinking about some of those long-term consequences and the risks of sort of straying from our values, from our principles in different ways. And I had to say, I think some of the just the agony of being distant from Washington and Washington policy making these decisions, and you could see your sort of growing frustration. Again, book is great, and I really encourage everybody to read it. Nancy, I want to ask you, do you agree with this assessment? Foreign policy driven more by inertia than principles, short-term political needs over long-term strategies?
I think that that's always a danger. One of the things that it's important to separate out, and we can talk about what's going on in the current administration, and I think that's certainly the case. But beyond the issues that we're struggling with now under the current administration, there has been a long-term sort of degradation of American diplomacy and I believe of the quality and caliber of US foreign policy. Part of that is due to what the last questioners, I think that very insightful question, and Lizzie gave a great answer talking about the electoral cycle and the very short time frame. But there's another aspect to it as well that I would underline, and that is that Americans in general tend to be very impatient. They like quick, definitive solutions. And that, along with a number of other factors, has led to us an over-reliance on using military means because it gives a definitive response, even if it's actually misleading and doesn't solve it. In many cases, it makes the situation worse. But so people get on with it. Oh, okay, we launched a missile. So now we've answered that challenge, and we forget about the root causes that are there. I think there's a real crying need right now for this country to look at what are the foundations of its foreign policy, what's the role of morality, and how do we operate more effectively around the world. And Lizzie's book gives a perfect example of what we should not be doing.
Well, and let me ask you this. We were talking about this a little bit before, and so I just want to pull this out as well. Is there a trend line here? I mean, the problems that we're talking about are not, I mean, this is one thing we say at the front. I don't think either of you believe that the problems we're talking about here are specific to the Trump administration or its period in office, but are longer lasting. So, Lizzie, you talked a little bit about history. I mean, decades of history sort of leading up to this moment. So maybe you could characterize first any trend lines you see in terms of the militarization of our foreign policy.
Absolutely. When I look at what's happening under the current administration, I see where we were going and then kind of this dramatic uptick, kind of like somebody's taken the governor off the accelerator, and some trends and some kind of bad habits we've been getting into in the last couple of decades in particular, in terms of turning repeatedly to our military, not only to do military activities, but to do our humanitarian aid, to do our to do our diplomatic acts because they're out in these places where we don't have enough resources on the other side. So it becomes a reinforcing cycle that we turn to the military because it has the resources, and then it keeps getting more resources. So we continue to turn to them. So what I see under the current administration is that all of those things that we have been trending towards quietly, but very, very certainly, there's just no more, there doesn't seem to be a reason anymore to make excuses about it. We're doing it rather boldly without trying to justify it anymore. This administration has made clear that they do not value the kind of slow work of diplomacy that you were in some ways under the last administration seeing kind of a resurgence in multilateral diplomacy in some areas with the Paris Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. So while you still had this push towards military in a lot of areas, there was still an appreciation of big diplomatic work. What I've seen that's been different here is that appreciation that takes more kind of more effort to do, and it's slower, and as Nancy had suggested, it's not as easy to see the quick wins. We've lost any of that appreciation whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, Andrew, if you're looking for a turning point in the past, it's really 9/11. And when you think about sort of the military resurgence in not just in terms of its capability, but it becomes the answer. And as everybody who's listening to this conversation knows, if you've got one instrument and that's a hammer, then every problem's going to look like a nail. You rely more and more on a military solution, and then your other capacities, whether it's development work, whether it's diplomacy, they atrophy. And so that's a real problem. The current administration, as Lizzie has rightly said, has continued that trend, but then has also gone further and is openly hostile, openly trying to disassemble many of the instruments of diplomacy, as well as the credibility underlying it. And we can get into lots of discussion about that. But one of the key things, and the reason why the title of Lizzie's book is so great, is the fact that you only get good solutions if you precede a policy decision with lots of debate and disagreement and dissent. That's how democracies work. That's how diplomacy, if you're going to get it right, works.
Well, let's talk about that. So the book is called The Dissent Channel, and I think this is a nice pivot, from. Well, let me say that. So your story that you're telling is a step-by-step sort of your experience in South Sudan, and I don't want to give away too much of the book here, but the sort of growing concerns about what you saw from the South Sudanese government and the limited or not just insufficient, but counterproductive reactions of the U.S. government in the face of growing abuses. The book is titled The Dissent Channel, and you go on to write in the book a Dissent Cable. So tell us first, what is the Dissent Channel? And then we want to hear about this particular experience that you went through.
Sure. So the Dissent Channel is, it's a storied tool in the State Department halls. It's this thing that we really revere because it's a formal ability for anyone in, any American employees of the State Department to put forward their concerns and their official dissent over formal policy. That, anything that differs from what the policies are currently going to be. And it's meant to be a tool of last resort. You are required to go through every other level of normal procedure, work through your bosses and your bosses' bosses before you get to the point of filing a dissent. But it was established back in the early 1970s in direct response to the Vietnam War and the growing disgust that we had with a lot of career foreign and civil service officers who were upset with the direction and with our kind of steady stream following the same policies in Vietnam. I apologize. I'm getting chased by like a ray of sun over here. It's the afternoon. I'm just going to move. So it's real, guys. Zoom is real. We have to challenge. So anyway, it was established in order to give really frustrated civil and foreign service officers an opportunity to make their complaints formally. And when I first learned of this, I thought it was this brilliant kind of high value, high level welcoming of dissent. And I think that it is in many ways, and by many people in the State Department, intended to be that. But at the same time, there is a real challenge with its functionality, which I'm not entirely sure wasn't intended at the time it was created, which is that you can go through the process of writing a dissent cable, and then you send it out into the universe, and it goes to the 7th floor, and it's meant to be read by very important people, and it's supposed to go to the secretary's office, and you are required under the regulations to get a formal written response. Without going into too much of the weeds here, the challenge is that this dissent message is not out in the open. It's a closed channel. You can't even, when I was looking into doing a dissent myself, because I was concerned about South Sudan policy, I searched our systems to try and find examples of prior dissents, and you can't access them because they're not searchable. And unless someone files a FOIA to get them decades later, you really can't get information on them. So I came to the conclusion in my process of filing a dissent and waiting for a response, which was thorough but seemed somewhat formulaic. I came to the conclusion that it was more of a pressure release valve than a real tool to foster debate, that it was something to allow someone like me and other people who are frustrated with our policies to say, well, I've done everything I could do. I did not get the impression that it really enabled or promoted discussion of alternative views. And to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any dissent cables that have really done that.
Nancy, I'm just curious your experience with, either the dissent channel or, the more broad experience of dissenting views being forwarded from Foreign Service officers then ground at different places to, policymakers, in DC.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, but let me start by laying what I think is a really important foundational point, and that is that American diplomats, and I think most people who are involved in professions that require complex issues, they're hired for their judgment. And in any setting where you are dealing with really big, complicated things, good leadership recognizes really that everyone has an obligation to dissent. They need to think about the pros and cons. They need to try to avoid falling into the trap of groupthink and conceptual bias, cognitive bias, and really open up the deliberations. So I think one of the failures that preceded what happened with Lizzie is the fact, and again, your experiences I think are not unusual, is that you weren't in a structure where people said, hey, thanks for giving us that differing perspective. Let's talk through what that means and how can we make sense of that? Because you can always debate coming down on one side or the other side of a very thorny issue. But unless you've looked at all perspectives, you're not going to come up with the best possible answer. So that's kind of point one. But, and I think the State Department needs to do much, much better throughout its structures, how it grows its future leaders, how it operates on a day-to-day basis. The dissent channel really is, in some respects, a last resort, or it's designed to be that. And it does become formulaic. I'm not aware that it has ever caused a dramatic policy shift. However, when you look at the history of the dissent channel, it's quite fascinating. Dissent channel messages have been sent, for example, during the Obama administration, when foreign service officers were troubled at US inaction in Syria. They were also sent during the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. Again, diplomats were troubled about the lack of action as it related to Srebrenica. So you can look at these examples. It's different issues, but it's people drawing attention. And I, having lived through both of those, it did draw attention. People looked hard at it. And even during the Trump administration, the very famous Dissent channel message that was sent on the travel ban, the Muslim ban, it brought a lot of attention. Didn't change it, but I think it shined a very important light.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking. Sorry,
I was
Lizzie,
just going to add, the only reason it brought light is because it was leaked, which I understand why it would be leaked. But it's frustrating.
As we're
please go ahead, Andrew.
Sorry. I just want to say, we're talking a little bit about the Trump administration, and I want to just pause for a second to say that the dissent of diplomats has really been a remarkably central theme during the Trump presidency. I think those of us who watch foreign policy issues closely see this, but I think for the broader American public, really, you've seen a number of things make headlines. We saw the dissent cable that you just referenced, Nancy, that got over 1,000 diplomats signing on in response to president's travel ban targeting Muslims. We saw the extraordinary national experience of watching Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch and Ambassador Bill Taylor testify before Congress during the impeachment proceedings. And then just this past week, the State Department's Inspector General was fired, apparently for investigating the Secretary's own misuse of public funds, among other things. So the issues you're raising in your personal experience and that you're raising, Nancy, and writ large, are really central to, I think, how you'd have to characterize some of the problems, the real weaknesses in the State Department today, and maybe in the Trump administration. I mean, are we living through a moment where you're seeing more dissent from public officials everywhere, where there's more of this battle between suppressing dissent and voices being raised? Maybe Lizzie, if you want to start.
Sure. I'll say, first of all, it's been fascinating to see so many people. It's not a large number, but the people who have ended up, in the hearings or otherwise in the news have been such excellent representations of what we have in the federal government. And I hope that one of the things that it has done has demonstrated to the American people, what wonderful resources they have working for them. I will say it's been interesting to see how, once the news came out last year about the quid pro quo and you had the whistleblower report, part of me kept thinking, with as many people as are on the phones and these different calls and as many people as review memos and whatnot, it's remarkable how little has come out. But that's because it's the culture. We are diplomats. We resolve problems. We don't create them. We work quietly in the background, and that's very much our nature. So I think it's important for the American people to understand how uncharacteristic it is for these types of people to come out to the fore. I mean, it means things are really, really bad, because that's just not our culture. It's kind of frowned upon. And in some ways, even, when I resigned, which ended up being quite publicly, I got a lot of support from people, but there was a level of discomfort in even kind of putting our dirty laundry out there. So I think that there is a lot to be gained from some of the benefits of that culture, but like everything, it needs some checks, and we need to, I think that it would be excellent for the profession and for the federal government in general if you have more of a welcoming culture of people standing up and saying this isn't right. The news this week with the slaughter of inspector generals is only going to make it that much harder, because you do not have a trusted source to go to report wrongdoing. I mean, that's a critical function.
That's exactly right, Lizzie. And, you talk about the culture of the State Department and people like Masha Yovanovitch and Bill Taylor. They didn't want to testify. They didn't seek that out. They actually, they were subpoenaed and they complied with it. Part of the culture is being nonpartisan, is recognizing that you're promoting a policy and an agenda, not yourself. But also, as I mentioned earlier, part of the culture is debating. And I'm troubled that has atrophied, that it's not really, that people like Lizzie, who came in a couple decades after I did, don't feel that sort of in the lifeblood of the organization. And Andrew, you talk about the latest in a series of inspector generals who have been fired by President Trump. That is such a troubling move, because it stifles dissent and debate. It puts a atmosphere of real dread and fear in the institutions, but it does something more. Because, in the same way that the Dissent channel was set up after the Vietnam War, the whole Inspector General system was set up after the abuses of Watergate. And everybody knows that when you cede power to another entity, you have to have some oversight, some check and balance. And those IGs are in place to make sure that there isn't the kind of abuse of power that you referenced. Maybe Pompeo himself is being investigated, or a decision that he took to provide arms to Saudi Arabia that skirted our normal procedures. Whatever it is, people shouldn't be afraid of it. They should welcome it, because that's what strengthens the institutions of government and ultimately serves the purpose of democracy.
This is incredible, and I really would have come back to this question of the state of the State Department and where we go next, but we have some great questions from the audience, so
Super.
I want to get to a couple of those, including this one from Daniel Krasenstein. For both speakers, what advice would you give to a 26-year-old American expat, my daughter, with amazing background, who has had aspirations?
I thought it was him.
Yeah. No, this is super apparent here. Who has aspirations of being a U.S. diplomat, but became disillusioned on the Department of State due to the current president.
Liz,
you want to start?
All right, I'll start. Absolutely pursue it. It's an incredible career, and it's incredibly important work. And we need to have enthusiastic people with at least a little idealism left going into it in order to have, the outcomes that are best for the American people. I do think that, and I've had a lot of people ask me this. If you go in now and, it takes a little while to get your feet under you and learn the ropes. So you're not likely to be in an experience in the next couple of years, or your first 2, 3, 4 years of your career, where you're facing something that's a real kind of existential question about whether you can pursue the job you're doing or not. But that said, I would just encourage anybody, not just going into the foreign service or diplomacy, but any job, always keep your sense about you of why you're there, what ends you're pursuing, and are the actions that you're taking as part of that job, the actions that you choose to take and the actions that you have to take because they're fundamental parts of your job. Can you sleep at night knowing that, what ends are being served by that? And this has been my advice for people who are still in the government, because trust me, I don't want everyone in the federal government to walk out tomorrow, even if I disagree with a lot of aspects of this administration. That would be absolutely detrimental. But I think people need to ask themselves, are the activities I'm doing day to day furthering an outcome that is detrimental to the purpose I'm trying to serve? And if you can be in any job and ask yourself that, you can still get all of the benefits of, what is an incredible career with the Foreign Service.
That's great advice, Lizzie. And the only thing I would add to Daniel as he tries to advise his daughter is to say, serving your country is tremendous. It's tremendously rewarding. We need people across the country to do that, to commit to national service. But in this field, and like every other, they have to have a very strong moral code. They have to be able to say, I'm doing this because of the principles and the values that I hold dear, and I will not allow those to be compromised. And if you do that, then you can navigate through very choppy waters, because the difficulties we're facing now they're temporary. But they're gonna be replaced by something else. And the world's getting more complicated, not less, and the moral dilemmas are going to be even tougher to navigate.
A very different question from our audience member. I'm going to ask the question and then maybe tack on to it a little bit. So from Joe Canardis, did the military-industrial complex make money supplying weapons in the civil war in South Sudan? And I think this is an interesting question that is probably on the minds of a lot of Americans as we think about our foreign policy. sharpened by statements that President Trump recently made when he said, listen, why are we selling weapons to Saudi Arabia? It's money and jobs. I mean, and there is some relationship between weapons manufacture in the States, members of Congress and the US government in general, starting to think about, jobs in general. And I'm curious sort of what your answer to that question is, Lizzie, and also if you were thinking about some of those things as well as a Foreign Service officer on the ground in this context.
Well, we were doing a lot of military assistance there. I'll be honest, I couldn't tell you whether whether specific American companies were making money through military sales. I'm not aware that that was going on, but I do know that there were military sales going on during the war. Someone was making money off of it, and it was certainly promoting and expanding the violence that was happening during the war. And one of my big questions, and a question that a lot of South Sudan watchers were asking at the time, was, why no arms embargo for a very long period of time, which would have shut down not the entire war and all of the violence, but it certainly would have limited the scale of violence that emerged again when things got very violent in Juba in 2016. So as a specific example of that, why was it so difficult to put in an arms embargo? It wasn't necessarily that it was a desire to have arms going into South Sudan, but it did have to do with some of the partners in the rest of the region who really didn't support that. And we have very close military ties with countries like Uganda. And I do believe that those ties were a big part of the obstacle to us making some of the better decisions that we might have made without that influence. So indirectly, I would say yes.
Nancy, can you speak to that same question?
Yes, and I'll broaden it beyond the South Sudan issue and thank Joe for asking the question, because it's always easy to say, oh, there's a crisis going on, and so we're going to sell weapons to help the people that we currently support. So instead of looking at South Sudan, let's look at Afghanistan. For a long time, the United States funneled a great deal of military assistance to the Mujahideen because they were fighting against the then Soviets. Well, guess what? A couple of years later, that Mujahideen morphed into the Islamic State, and all of the assistance that we had provided to them was and continues to be used against us. So it's both the short-term itis that we talked about earlier, but also people just saying, if we don't sell arms, someone else will, which for the United States to be sort of the arms provider to the world, I think is such a short-sighted and really self-destructive approach. There are times when it's justified. There are times when we need to do it. But I think we have to look at what our first purpose is. Our goal is to try to make peace the norm, all right? We want a world that is stable and peaceful. We want military activity to be the exception to that. And so at every turn, we have to stop, pause, and to say, what are the short and long-term ramifications of our actions? And how might this go wrong? And because invariably it does. And we only know that after the fact, but we've already moved on to something else and haven't taken the time to do that historical look back so that it can inform the future of what our diplomacy is and our statecraft more broadly. And that's something that I think going forward, the State Department and the US government overall needs to do.
You know, we've talked a lot about the role of foreign service officers in advancing our own serving Americans' interests, your role on the ground as a consular officer. There's a piece missing in the snapshot that we've conveyed in this event that's in your book, which is how you were received by your counterparts in South Sudan. You were dealing with a number of people besides just, the government, the executive branch. And I wonder if you could just describe that. And I guess what I'm getting at is, what were the expectations of your counterparts when they met with a human rights officer representing the U.S. government?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting question, because it's like anything that deals with personalities. So much of it depends on the person that you're dealing with. And South Sudan, as critical as I am of the government that was in charge there, like every other place that I've worked, you've got some wonderful people who are counterparts in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in other ministries. I had very close relationships with quite a few of them. And I think that many of them saw the country more clearly than we did. And they struggled with the challenges, but at the same time, they really wanted to help their country, their home, get back on their feet. I found that, I was a worker bee. I was a junior officer, so I had other worker bees as my counterparts. And as I found, in a lot of parts of even our government, the worker bees often have a different view than the people higher up, and it's not as experienced. It's often not as informed by a wider variety of issues, but it's often a little bit more pure, I guess, in terms of seeing and calling things how you see them. So it became very difficult after the war started, though, because the counterparts we had, suddenly became parts of the opposition or parts of the government. And at that stage, it became really hard for me to have honest conversations with everyone who was still there. It's particularly, as you say, Andrew, when I'm asking them about human rights abuses. Before the war started, I had folks I could go to who would say, yeah, that's a real problem and we need to deal with it. And then there would always be the ones who would say, I don't know what you're talking about, we're doing perfectly fine. After the war started, I found that it became harder and harder as the government began to kind of close ranks around their story of how the war started. And at that stage, it became harder and harder for me to find trusted counterparts inside the country. But it's a fascinating dynamic that to me is really personal. And it's very individual, person to person. But Andrew, you and I, you mentioned something earlier about a specific incident that I had that's written about in the book. When I was in Kampala and I was meeting with an ousted minister who was in the opposition at that point. And he was telling me about his experience with how one of his sons had been killed in the first days of the war in Juba. And his other son, he had just found out, had died while he was studying abroad. He was certain that there was something nefarious involved in his second son's death. I never learned a lot about it, but it was this moment when I was sitting with him in the garden at the Serena Kampala Hotel, and it was about 3 or 4 weeks into the war at that point, and tears just started pouring down my face. I was so mortified. I was this junior officer talking to a South Sudanese minister, in exile, and I just couldn't keep it together at that point. And he ended up wrapping up and quickly leaving. I thought he was obviously embarrassed at my tears, but he emailed me that night to tell me that it had just touched him so much to see a US official shed a tear for his loss, and how he believed and he was convinced that because of that, he knew that the United States was going to help his country avenge the evils that had happened to his people during the violence. And it was this moment of recognizing that there were people in the South Sudanese, exiled government at that, kind of exiled members of the government at that point, who still had this faith that we were going to do something. And it was both a personal connection and also just a real point of disappointment, because you realize that you've allowed people to believe in you, in your position, and then, maybe we're letting them down. So it's all of it, very personal. So
it's such a great story. And what it highlights for me is the fact that people all around the world for decades have looked to the United States as kind of a beacon of light, a standard for defending human rights and promoting truth. That's something that I very much hope becomes a part of but it is still a part of who we are, and I hope it becomes a part of the diplomacy that we take into the future.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, this is really, I just think it's such a rich and incredible narrative of your experience. And I think it tees up some really important questions for this moment. Not only are we at a natural inflection point because of a political cycle, there's a possibility of a new administration that could bring change to the State Department. We're also going through this pandemic, global pandemic, which is raising questions, which not only, first of all, is centering the importance of fact, the importance of, dissenting views and using real information and making decision making, but also is raising questions about the future of our foreign policy, our priorities. So with all of that as a setup, let me ask a question that's actually coming from the audience to kind of crystallize this. There's no, this is Caitlin Conati. There's no doubt that the Trump administration has undermined and gutted state. Could the resulting vacuum be an opportunity to rebuild in a smarter, more strategic way under a new administration? What should be the priorities? And I'll just say a couple other participants have asked about how all this fits into the context of the coronavirus and what that tees up for the future. So Nancy, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I know Lizzie will have a lot of thoughts as well. The first thing I would say is that, just to put it in the context of today, because we're doing this online instead of in person, what the coronavirus tells me is that people around the world are going to recognize that facts matter, that there is truth and untruth, but also that expertise matters, that you have to apply science to problems that lend themselves to scientific solutions, and that international collaboration is absolutely indispensable. Unless we're all going to stay buried in our homes like they're nuclear bunkers and never leave our countries or cross international borders, we are in this together. We have to find better ways to collaborate. In terms of the State Department going forward, I'd mention just a couple of things. First and foremost, we have to have an administration and a public, a national public, that says diplomacy is the instrument of first resort. We want to use diplomacy to solve the problems. You know, I'm a professional diplomat, but I also come from a military family. And every military officer that I know personally and have worked with, they don't want us to go to war as a knee-jerk reaction. They know the implications of it. So you start with an understanding that diplomacy is your instrument of first resort, but then you have to make the State Department more effective. And Caitlin's exactly right. The State Department needs to have more professionalization, more expertise in new areas of real concern, less of a political input, and we can talk about what that means in terms of political appointees and also partisan activities. But I also think it needs to be a more modern, more agile, really more dynamic institution. And I hope it gets great people like Lizzie and others who left the State Department. They're going to say, hey, that's a great place to work. It's an important mission and mandate. Sign me up again.
Well, thank you. That is tremendously rich and helpful. And then Lizzie, I want to ask you the same question about the future of American diplomacy, about what you hope for from perhaps a new administration. But I also want you to zoom in a little bit on specific reforms to the State Department and how it operates that you think might improve some of the specific dynamics that you were dealing with.
Sure. I mean, for starters, I would say that, yes, I do think that this is the next administration, when we have a change in administration, is going to be an opportunity to take the rubble that is left after kind of the decimation of our diplomatic position and abilities and capabilities right now. The benefit of burning it all down is that you do have a chance to pick up and really reassess in a way that I don't think we've done in decades. I believe that it's a very natural habit with new administrations to come in and kind of seek consensus agreement on things, and kind of you layer over a few improvements, but you're not really able to make massive changes because you have this short timeline you're working with and you're trying to get the low-hanging fruit. So maybe this is an opportunity to really force us to rethink. And if it is, I would say in terms of very specific things that I would look at. One is, if you want to rebalance our foreign policy where we are putting diplomacy first over military reactions, and I might make a shout out that it is Memorial Day weekend we're going into, and if you want to respect the troops and appreciate the troops, don't send them to pointless wars, for starters. But if you want to have a State Department that's ready to take on the challenges of this century, you need to invest, more in longer term training, which we've never been able to do because we've had budget constraints on that. Our military officers are able to go and get, master's degrees paid for, which we have. We don't have the same sense of, it's not as inbuilt, it's basically considered not career enhancing necessarily to take time off to do more studies and education and training in the State Department. And that's something that we need to do more of. I think that we do need to invest more, as Nancy mentioned, in the expertise that we're lacking. Particularly a problem in our development world and in some military aspects, but also with the State Department. We tend to contract out a lot of the expertise rather than to have it in-house, so that we've got those skills and abilities and real deep knowledge that you need to, let's say you're negotiating a climate change treaty, like you need to have that expertise in the room and with a historical lens on it. And we're somewhat limited on that now. And then I would also suggest that we look into ways of bringing people in mid-career. I love the fact that I started off at the very bottom of the barrel in the Foreign Service, and my career would never have been the same without the consular requirements. But I do think that at a time when we've really gutted the center of the State Department, we've got to be creative with how we bring in expertise, because you grow, right now we grow diplomats from from seeds. And I think that's really important, but I think we need to be a little bit flexible on how you fill out that expertise and management levels at a time when we don't have enough right now because of the changes in the gutting in the last few years.
Well, these are excellent notes to end us on, and I am really encouraged by the wealth of thinking right now that's going into how do we revitalize American diplomacy. And there is always this opportunity at the tail end of an administration that pushes one way. You hope there's an opportunity for the next administration to push far in the opposite direction. And so that is the possibility. And I think you've given us tons of just food for thought about reforms that can be helpful, but also, Lizzie, you grounded it in these really compelling stories that helped us understand what your life was like and what the lives are like of other Foreign Service officers. So thank you for this incredible book. Really, again, encourage everybody to go out and read it. I know I'm to turn over now to Trita, and I'll just thank you again for to pulling together this great event. So.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you so much to Lizzie and to Nancy. This was a wonderful conversation. As you mentioned, Andrew, the need to revitalize our diplomacy. And I think one thing that came through in this conversation is that a lot of what we're dealing with right now did not just come about in the last couple of years. The roots have been there for much before that. And in order to revitalize it, we need to address those issues in a much deeper way. And we cannot do so if we do not allow dissent within the government, if we are forcing ourselves into some form of a groupthink inside and outside of the government. So I'm really encouraged by this conversation and helping us move away from that. I want to thank you all once more time for agreeing to do this and sharing your thoughts with us. Before I leave, I just wanted to quickly let the viewers know about some of the upcoming events that we have. On May the 27th, next Wednesday, we actually have two events on the same day. First, an event that addresses the dire need for a fundamental rethinking of the US-Saudi relationship. And we're delighted to have with us on that panel discussion, Aaron David Miller, Greg Gause, as well as Madawi Al-Rashid. Then later that evening, we will have a panel discussion with that is co-hosted by the East Asia Foundation in South Korea, which will deal with both the South Korean parliamentary elections, the impact on US-South Korean relations, but also how the increasing tensions between the United States and China is affecting the countries in the region, including South Korea. We will have Congressman Ami Bera with us for that conversation, as well as Dr. Moon Jung-in, who is a special advisor to South Korean President Moon Jae-in. So if you haven't already, please go to quincyinst.org and sign up for our newsletter, as well as to Foreign Policy for America's website and sign up for their newsletter so that you will be notified of future events that we're holding. So with that, thank you so much for today and hope to see you all next week. Thank you.